Hello everyone, this is Duan. If you ever used Tailwind CSS before, you've probably come across the case where the default design system for Tailwind is not enough to make your own component or your own design. So in that scenario, you probably added some CSS to it or you did some customization on the Tailwind configuration. But today I'm going to show you three simplest ways you can add your own styles to the Tailwind CSS. So let's get started. So the first way you can add your own styles is actually just write some CSS. So in your globals CSS file, you do have something like this. So you have directive, tailwind, base for component and utilities. You can simply add your styles here. So since this is a CSS file, for example, if you want to specify the font size of a for example, H1 element, you can just do this. Font size, for example, 18 pixels. But this is actually not a recommended way of doing it because on the Tailwind documentation page, it actually says that if you injecting styles this way, it will actually not get purged, even though if you're not using this style. And also it will cause some specificity issues. So let's try to avoid this pattern. So the recommended way of doing it is actually using a directive called layer. So to inject the default global CSS, we'll do layer base, and then we will have the same as before, H1 font size 18 pixels. And this will change the style accordingly. The second way you can add your own CSS, probably my personal favorite, is something called the just-in-time mode. So by the time of this recording, the just-in-time mode came out not too long ago. And what it does is basically compiling only the CSS that you need, and it makes the dev environment really fast because you no longer have a massive Tailwind CSS package that slows down your browser, your dev tools. And the other thing it does that's amazing is that you can actually use your own variables in your class names. I'm going to show you a demonstration here. So if you want to add the just-in-time mode, you can just go to tailwindconfig.js and have a mode and git for just-in-time, give it a save. And then you can go back to any of your component that uses the Tailwind CSS. For example, I have a H4 header here. And as you can see, I have some text font size and text align center. And what if you want to do a minimum height of 100 pixel for this? You're probably thinking maybe you can add some styles like what we did before into the global CSS, but you don't have to do that here. With the just-in-time mode, you can simply write minimum height instead of specifying like the options here, the 0, the full, or the screen. You can put a square bracket here and just put 100 pixel in there. Done. Isn't it amazing? And you can do this with all other variables as well, all other class names. So for example, you can do with colors with hex code, you can do padding, you can do font size, basically everything with the just-in-time mode. And I highly recommend using this method, and it's great. Okay, so the third way to add your own CSS into the Tailwind is using something called plugins. The Tailwind has some utilities for making your own plugins, or you can use someone else's plugin. There's a documentation that covers how you can make plugins. Basically, the plugins are something that uses JavaScript to inject CSS into your style sheet. I'm not going to cover too in-depth into how you can make plugins. You can refer to the official documentation. You can do a lot of things with it. So in this video, I'm going to show you the two official plugins that made by Tailwind CSS team you probably don't know about. and they're super handy in making your basic styling work. So the one I'm going to show you is something called a form and a typography. To start, the form plugin have some basic styling to make it look better than your default HTML element. I have a Markdown editor here I've showed you earlier. So at the top, this is basically a text area element. And you can see it doesn't have any paddings around the text. It has this very accent heavy dark color, which most people don't really like. And it's just not a very good starting point to work with this form. So what we can do is install the packages. So the earlier I said the Tailwind CSS forms. Once you installed, you can do require and then in Tailwind CSS forms. And for this particular plugins, once you added the plugins here, it's done. So you can do some other configurations, but for the most part, you don't have to add any class names. So if I go back to my text editor, it has this bluish border. And if I select this element here, you can see there's some padding to it. And if you look closely, there are also some shadows to it, a little bit of it, which is pretty nice. And the default on focus state has this a little grayish border, which is also pretty nice as well. So it's a better starting point to style your forms if you wish to. It's pretty handy. It has a lot of other input element covered as well, as for example the checkbox, email, password, and it's really nice. And the other one is called typography. Tailwind by default doesn't. So I have this markdown text here. For example, this one translates to H1 element. So if I select it, so this is the H1 element, this is the H2 and H3 and so on. So those elements by default doesn't actually have different font size. The ordered list and unordered list doesn't have any style to them. This is by default in Tailwind CSS. And because we have added this as a markdown text, you can't really add class name to it. And one solution is using the typography plugin. So if you go back to the Tailwind config, once you installed it, you can require it. So it's the typography. And this is a little different. Once you set this up, you still need to go to your Markdown wrapper. So for example, this is my Markdown component that renders all the Markdown text as I shown earlier. And this is my wrapper. So in the wrapper, what you can do is add a class that called prose. Once it's added, it will have all the child element have some basic markdown styles. So let's give it a go. So as you can see, we have some interesting changes. For example, the heading text font size is being changed. We have order list, on order list, it looks pretty nice. So I have a link, you have some pre-element. So this is a pre-element with a dark background, which is pretty nice. You have also this table here. They all look better than the initial, like the default setting. It's a good starting point to style your design system further. What if you're asking, I want to use plugin, how do I customize on top of this plugin? Yes, you can do it. For example, if I want to change the typography plugin for this H1 element, I want to make it a little bigger, for example. I can go to the theme configuration and I can call extend, and which will go to typography, which is the plugin we're using. And then we're changing the default setting, so default. And then we're changing the CSS of the default setting. And finally, we're changing the H1 element, right? H1, and we're using a camel case here. So font size, and let's say, for example, I want to change it to 80 pixel. As you can see, it has a lot of nesting to it, and this is pretty low level as the package stated, and you can do a lot of things with it, but it can get a little harder to read. But this is basically the idea. And if you go back, you can see the H1 now has the 80 pixel, as you can show here. Alright, so that wraps up 3 ways you can add your own styles in the Tailwind CSS. I hope this video helped you in doing those configurations and the customizations, and I highly recommend you to check out the official documentation. There are a lot more things you can do with it, and also there's a video about just-in-time, which is very interesting. Make sure to check that out as well. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more related content, make sure to like and subscribe. I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.